Sherry here at Onyx Pages. Thanks very much for watching. This is just a very quick intro to my interview with Walidah Imarisha. Walidah is absolutely fantastic. She's a spoken word artist. She is a professor. She is a writer. She is a convener of Amazing Humans, and she is just a lovely person, lovely human. I had the opportunity to meet her at the Other Futures conference in Amsterdam last year, which I can now say since it is now 2019. And I participated in a workshop that she did that got a whole group of people engaged in a social justice oriented world building exercise. And it was absolutely mind blowing. It inspired me to think about how I can read more progressively, how I might want to write more progressively. And it got me thinking about world building and fiction as one way of engaging in activism. I hope that you enjoy this interview with her, and if you haven't had an opportunity yet, after you've watched this, please check out the newly revamped 7-calorie shell rating system, because it's been informed in part by Walidah's writing and her thinking and her way of changing worlds. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this interview, please give it a big thumbs up. If you have something to say, then leave a comment. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Onyx Pages, I would really appreciate it if you did so. Okay, thanks. Bye.
So thank you very much for making time for me, and welcome to the Onyx Pages world. I asked you to join us because I've talked about your work before, Walidah, and but the folks who are a part of this channel haven't yet had an opportunity to actually see the fabulousness that is you. So thanks for sharing time. I guess I'll just start with a basic question about the kind of literature that you produce, and why do you produce the literature that you produce?
Okay. Well, first I want to say thank you for having me, and Onyx is amazing. So I hope everyone's, obviously if they're watching this, they're watching you, but they should watch all of you. So, so I work in a lot of different genres. I started out as a spoken word artist. I've done journalism. I've done academic work. Most recently, I've been doing kind of creative nonfiction. I have a book focused on prisons, and then science fiction, and really engaging with the idea, someone, who's wanting a newer, better, just world. How can writing and literature be something that can aid us in imagining and then implementing ways to get to that new world?
And so the folks on my channel do know you because we did that interview when I was at Other Futures with you in Amsterdam. The sound quality is better now, so. And one of the things that I loved about what you were talking about, and for me, when I heard you speak, I knew in my mind that activism and reading and activism and writing and creating were very important combinations for me, very important tools and strategies. But until you put it all together, I didn't really have a premise to sort of work from. So I'm curious about that connection that you make between activism and science fiction. When did that come about for you, and what is that connection?
Sure. Well, I've been into science fiction my whole life, and I think when I became politically active, I sort of put it to the side as something that didn't really have relevance to trying to change the world and obtain liberation. And I was lucky enough to come full circle and find other radical nerds, and to really realize this passion and love of science fiction was not about escaping this world. It was about having enough space to imagine different worlds and to imagine myself into stories that had been, previously closed to me because of my identity. And so I started using the term visionary fiction to really talk about fantastical art that can help us to imagine different worlds and to imagine different ways to get to those different worlds. So visionary fiction isn't about utopia. It's not necessarily about what is the most perfect society, though that, you know, elements of utopia are obviously in it. But I think, especially as someone who has been involved in community organizing, the thought is, how do we, you know, use these imaginations for the future to do differently so we can get to different places.
Now, I know that your work, well, I'm not sure if this is the main part of your work, but I see on the socials that a lot of your work is around prison justice and prison reform. Those are my terms. I'm not sure if those are the terms that you use to describe your work and your activism. I'm curious about that as your focus, and what kind of vision of the future do you have for the incarcerated and for the prison industrial complex as it is right now?
Yeah, I've been doing work around prisons for all my adult life, and from a lot of different areas. And I think it was when I was working with a group of prisoners' families in Philadelphia called the Human Rights Coalition, and we really made a shift from being sort of a reform-focused organization to an abolitionist organization, to an organization that says that the existence of prisons actually makes us less safe, not more safe, and that there are ways to hold people accountable and address harm done that focus on healing and, you know, restoration and wholeness, rather than brutality, punishment, control, retribution, which is, you know, the ways that these current justice systems manifest. And so I think really engaging in prison abolition was something that felt incredibly empowering, because I think as someone who, you know, works around prisons, you spend so much time working just so things don't get worse. And you know, a successful campaign is like, oh, you didn't pass that even worse thing you were planning to do, and we just spent a year and woo, we won, right? And those are, you know, those pieces are really important, because, you know, the reality is, you know, people I love are incarcerated, and I want to do whatever is necessary to ensure that they not only survive, but have, you know, the potential to have as many of their needs met. But I think that has to happen within a context of a larger vision, a vision that says, we want people to survive, but, you know, we want them to survive to a different future, not to more of this. And I've found that, you know, visionary fiction and science fiction is actually incredibly useful when talking about prison abolition, because most people can't imagine not having prisons in this world. They think of it as science fiction. And so it really helps to say, all right, then it's science fiction. We're on a totally different world. It's green people, you know, don't worry about it. So now what do these green people do when someone commits harm? Mm-hmm. And folks are so much more willing to be open, to be imaginative, to think outside of that. And I think, you know, the important piece then is to say, okay, and so now we have to bring that back home. Mm-hmm. And if the green people can do that, like what can we do? Because, you know, we can be the green people.
We can be the green people. And so visionary fiction, then what exactly is it? I know that there are a number of principles. So can you take us through them? And maybe, I mean, you've teased a little bit by talking about how it relates to the work, the prison justice work that you do, but what are the core elements of visionary fiction? And also, how did you give birth to this framework?
Yeah, so I mean, I was working with Left Turn magazine, which was a national organizing magazine. I was on the editorial board, but when I first started out, I did a guest edit. And the thing that was amazing about Left Turn is that the goal was to always highlight the way folks were resisting and organizing and changing things. So if there was an article about, you know, the devastation after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, it included and most often centered folks doing work on the ground to change that. So it wasn't just, here's all the terrible things that are happening in the world. You know, it was, our goal was always to say, you know, there are always people resisting any repression. And we want to make sure that as we're conveying these issues, we're conveying and really trying to center that resistance and that, you know, other world building people were already doing. And so I think Left Turn was kind of a perfect place to propose what I did, which was science fiction and social change issue of really looking at those intersections. And, you know, I was doing it with Morgan Phillips, who is an amazing trainer and organizer who helped me really kind of begin to conceptualize visionary fiction. We did kind of a very rough draft of some of the principles and did a workshop. And I think it was definitely very deeply when I started working with Adrienne Marie Brown and co-editing our anthology, Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements, and her work around emergent strategy, which if people haven't read her book, Emergent Strategy, you have to read it right now because it will save your life and your movement and the world. So just like read it. But I think, you know, I think that they definitely, the kind of development of visionary fiction was in sort of symbiosis and communication, definitely with emergent strategy and really thinking about, you know, emergent strategy being in some ways, how do we implement this in the world, and visionary fiction kind of being like, how do we even begin to imagine what we could implement? Mm-hmm. And so I think the two of them really pairing super well together. And so visionary fiction, the sort of definition I've come up with, and I think, you know, I think the thing is, you know, I used a term, I wanted to use a term because, you know, I was saying science fiction, and I think people were bringing their own sort of preconceived notions of what that means. Sure. And so, you know, I was like, no, not that. No, not that. Not that. Nothing with a white military dude in a spacesuit who saves the world. No, not that. And so really wanting to kind of have a language to talk about specifically and focus in on this science fiction that could help us imagine different worlds. But I mean, you know, obviously folks have been doing that work forever, and especially, you know, marginalized and oppressed peoples, it's often just built into our DNA to, you know, implement that in the work we're doing. So, you know, I started using the term to have sort of a shortcut way to talk about it, but, you know, I definitely think it's something that has, you know, developed and grown with so many people, and it's part of a legacy. As Adrienne says, it's, you know, it's a recovery, not a discovery. And so, you know, really always want to root in that. And also that I feel like it's kind of continually evolving as I engage with more folks, as I, you know, read more things, really thinking about, oh, right, you know, how does this really pair in? So that was a very long disclaimer, but great. So visionary fiction is fantastical writing that helps us to understand current power dynamics and helps us to imagine new ways to build different futures. And so that's kind of the framework. And I'm a writer, so I focused on writing, but lots of different people are using visionary fiction and expanding it into other forms of art, which I think is amazing and incredible to see how that's moving. But there are sort of principles to that, because, you know, the thing is, we have to tell different kinds of stories if we want to get somewhere else, because everything is a story. And I think that's the piece that's really important is, you know, everything we're getting is just input, right? Like everything we're taking in is input. The way we make sense of it is the story we construct out of it. And so I think it's important to say, if we want different futures, we can't keep telling the same sort of stories and think we're going to get there. And so really thinking about, you know, the stories that will get us there are the stories that center oppressed peoples and see through their eyes. It's definitely the stories that center the leadership and vision of marginalized people, especially those who sit at the intersections of oppression. So really seeing that, you know, some of, I think, the visionary fiction that has the most vibrant and exciting and incredible futures that I've seen are written by, you know, LGBTQ folks of color, or folks of color with disabilities who are immigrants, or people who are all of those identities and more, because that's when we actually begin to see what true liberation can look like. And so visionary fiction is about identity, but it's also about power. And that's really why Octavia Butler's work is so important to us, is because, you know, she really gave us frameworks for different ways to think about power. How do we, like, what is power? How do we hold power? How do we take power? And then what do we do with it when we have it? And so visionary fiction is not just about putting brown people in the same sort of power hierarchies that already exist in the stories we have. It's about saying, you know, how is this change going to be collective? How is it going to be decentralized? How is it going to be anti-colonial? How is it going to, you know, center the most marginalized? How is it going to get us to some place that we haven't been yet? Mm-hmm. And it's by really deeply embedding those principles that we see, you know, different stories emerge and different endings or different beginnings, and that we can really begin to think about how can we bring that back to the work that we're doing on the ground.
I just this morning, found out about, I think it's a series of animated shorts that come from a story written by Justina Ireland. I think it's called A Theory of Flight. And it tells the tale of a Black woman who was, I think she's a scientist, or I think she's a scientist / engineer. And it's in this world where poor and marginalized otherwise marginalized people are living on Earth, and I guess we're at a point where the air isn't breathable. It's super, super hot, so you can't leave buildings and so on. But there's this other planet, I think it's called Europa, where rich people have been traveling to. And she's this amazing scientist who has built these ships to get these rich people there. She gets fired from her job, and then she starts building these ships in these neighborhoods, and she uploads the blueprint and puts it on the common internet so that everybody who can also build ships around the world can get access to it. And she hires this very hot Black female pilot to take the first ship and go. And for me, that I saw it this morning, and I thought this is an amazing answer to the you have to go to an elite Starfleet. And then if you get chosen by Starfleet, then you get to you know, get in the ship and go to all these different places, and you've got a prime directive that allows you to effectively colonize wherever you go for this greater good, right? And for me, I see that as an example of visionary fiction, sort of like who's at the center. How do we change this sense of access to the future and access to better environments for a few to that for a collective group. And that's the kind of thing, when I was sitting and listening to you speak, I thought, you know, I'm starting to identify these principles in the books that I'm reading, and realizing that actually these are the characteristics of these stories that are the most inspiring for me. So I think of things like An Unkindness of Ghost by River Solomon, and just a number, I don't want to start naming them, but just a number of different stories and works that are really taking at least that space travel trope and turning it on its head and asking questions about interdependence and about collective power and power sharing and moving over and sharing privilege and advantage. So that I appreciate you putting it together, because it's really changed the way that I approach how I read, and has actually inspired me to try my hand at writing, because I do think that we each have sort of our story to tell from our own vantage points. It doesn't have to be good writing, I say to myself, it just has to be done. So I appreciate that. How has visionary fiction been used in groups? You took us through an amazing workshop at the Other Futures Conference, where we all had an opportunity to create to identify, I think you had us identify a problem and to world build around that, and then to present these ideas. And it was a very powerful and thrilling experience. And we all needed more time, but we were able to come up with some really amazing stories in the time that we had. Apart from workshops like that, how is visionary fiction being used by groups that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a big piece for Adrienne and myself with Octavia's Brood. Is we obviously wanted the anthology, but we also wanted it to be a beginning point so that other folks, you know, are like, here's 20 stories and 2 essays, and, you know, I read them, and now I'm going to add my voice to this as well. And so we developed a number of different workshops along with other people like Morgan, Leah Lakshmi, Pyapsna Samarasinha, Alexis Pauline Gums, just, you know, so many amazing folks. And I think that's one of the, I mean, there are so many great things about Octavia's Brood and being connected to it, but I think being connected to some of the people whose work in the community and creative work inspires me is just so exciting, because I get to be like, they're also a brooder. That's what we call folks in Octavia's Brood. So they're a brooder too, by the way. But so we all, you know, they're collaboratively developed a lot of different workshops. And so because the idea is really to collectively engage in dreaming these futures, rather than, you know, this very sort of individualist notion that we're, you know, given usually of you know, you decide your fate by yourself individually, you know, under capitalism, rather saying collectively we are so much more brilliant. So how do we harness that and come together and create a space where we can let our imaginations roam without, as far as we're able to. And I think that, you know, that is the thing that is most terrifying is decolonized imaginations. And that's why the society spends so much time trying to reinforce these, you know, barriers in our minds. This is what's possible. This is what's not possible. Yeah. Because if we really recognize, like, actually we can build anything we can imagine, then, you know, this system would fall tomorrow. And so, you know, I think we worked very hard to create workshops and collaborative spaces for folks to do that, and also for folks to play. You know, Adrienne talks a lot around emergent strategy and her new book, which is on pleasure activism, which is coming out soon. Yeah, it's so good. I know. So awesome.
Have you read it? Were you able to read an advance copy?
No, I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
Yeah. But I already know it's amazing. So
yeah.
But you know, that space of play is absolutely necessary, and it doesn't diminish the fact that we're dealing with life and death issues. But if we are to remain whole and human, then we have to embrace these pieces of, you know, play and fun and joy as well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, folks, it's easier to let go in an imaginary world than in the real world. Yeah. And so trying to create those spaces for folks to do that. And so we've done, you know, workshops around the world to create that. We've worked with organizations to incorporate this into kind of the ways they're building their strategies and work in the community in a number of different ways. So, you know, just trying to put it out there and see, you know, and if it's something that resonates with people, then saying, like, how can we support that, and how can we, you know, build more and more possibilities.
I'm thinking about visionary fiction and how it can assist booktube. So as you know, booktube is a part of YouTube that's made up of content creators who read a lot of books. We read a lot of books, we borrow a lot of books from the library, we buy a tremendous amount of books, and we promote a lot of books. And one of the most traditional kinds of videos that we upload are book reviews, where we obviously talk about our reading experience. And they're not normal sort of run-of-the-mill book reviews because they're oriented towards a community of readers. And so we tend to get reflections that are a little bit different from what you would expect from a magazine book review. So people will talk about things like plot and character and so on. But we, and I try to resist this, but I'm a part of this community. We are sometimes motivated by things like popularity of books and, you know, what's the latest thing? Oh my gosh, has everybody read Children of Blood and Bone? That's the latest thing. Oh my gosh, it's Dread Nation now. Oh my gosh, it's Marlon James's new piece, right? So there's a lot of like energy around what we're reading. And so in my view, I think since we're going to be reading this stuff anyway, and since we're going to be reading stories that will retell old tropes in empowering ways, but we might also be reading those old tropes without any kind of twist or turn or question on any of the principles that are in visionary fiction. I wonder what advice you might have for readers in the booktube community or in general who are trying to challenge themselves to read, to consume literary works more critically, whether those works are designed to question power dynamics and to envision different futures, or whether they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have, like a media literacy and understanding and a critical reflection on everything we're taking in. And I think at the same time, holding like we can still enjoy things that, we're also critical of, because nothing's perfect in this world. And, I think again, finding, joy is important. And so I also just want to be clear, visionary fiction is certainly not the only kind of, sci-fi or fantasy or whatever that's important or that will help us get free even. I think, dystopias are great, like alternative timelines where everything's so much more terrible are great. The traditional stories about someone who has power and privilege being like, oh, whoa, people are oppressed. Whoa, I had no idea. Like, let me find my place in that, right? I'm like, yes, those all need to happen. They're not necessarily visionary fiction. And again, the use of visionary fiction is if it helps us move forward. And for me, it's just a way of kind of shining a light or highlighting specific things that I think are often marginalized or overlooked when we are reflecting on these works. So I just want to give that framework that everything doesn't have to be visionary fiction, and it can still be incredibly, useful and meaningful and essential for us moving towards liberation. But I do think, I think one question, again, the 2 points really about visionary fiction are about identity and power. Those are the 2 kind of principles, and then there's these kind of subsettings. So oftentimes when I'm reading books, I think who is the most oppressed group in this book? Is this from their perspective? If it's not, how would this story look different if it was from that perspective? I think I always use the original Blade Runner as an example of this. It's the story of this slave catcher who's chasing, androids, chasing replicants who were created to be enslaved. And the few who dare to try and be free, these sentient creatures, are hunted down and murdered. And that story is told through the eyes of a slave catcher. I don't want to see that. Like I hated Blade Runner when I was a kid. And I'm like, some of that it was slow, and I wasn't great, super sophisticated in my taste, but I think most of it was, just feeling really upset about having to empathize or identify in any way. I'm like, I don't care about your moral dilemma of like, you still murdered these people, like at the end of the day. Like, I felt bad though. It was hard for me to murder these folks seeking freedom from slavery, and I always think if that story was told through the eyes of the replicants, and even within that, because then people are like, oh, the main replicant, Roy Batty, who is this, he's a male replicant. I'm like, what if it was told through the eyes of Pris, who's a female replicant who's called a pleasure bot, right? So that we're looking at oppressed people and that the intersection of replicant enslavement with gendered oppression as well. I can only imagine the gendered horrors she lived through. That story would be completely different. And the main character, Deckard, would look like a monster. He would probably be almost unrecognizable to us. So I think it's really important as we're, folks are reading stories to really be thinking about that, and to really, not just be like, oh, it's a white dude who's the main character, but to really explore the other possibilities then of saying, okay, well then who are the oppressed peoples? And then really think creatively, what might this story look like if it was told? When would it start? A lot of times stories are someone with privilege coming in and being like, oh, there's oppression. If it was rooted in that community, that story probably would start hundreds of years before. And what would that history look like? And so really, asking those questions about identity. And then I think the questions around power are often about what other options are there? Because I think, especially in sort of mainstream, science fiction or fantasy storytelling, we're presented with two options, right? Like the Hunger Games option of the Capitol or, District 13. And they're both supposedly terrible, right? And I'm like, yes, of course. The communal folks are as bad as the capitalists, right? They're both awful. But really thinking about, if Katniss didn't just kind of give up at the end and be like, whatever, I'll just marry whatever dude's closest to me and pop out some babies. Like, what could have been real other options for imagining what, like, deep dirt root, grassroots change would look like in that world in Panem? It would look really different than how the book ended, which was really sort of a reinstatement of the status quo that was slightly better than when it started. Yeah. And that's, those are the options we get in a lot of mainstream storytelling is, at the end, the status quo has to be reinstituted, usually with a little bit of reform. Like, oh, we didn't actually need to tear it all down. We just needed to make it a little better. Usually in sci-fi, we needed to blow something up or kill someone, and then everything's fine. And I'm like, those are legit tactics, but that's not a goal, because that doesn't address the institutionalized systemic ways that oppression and brutality, tyranny, and fascism are embedded in these systems that are created. And so to really ask those questions, and I think, again, Octavia Butler is such an amazing example to critically think about that. Her characters are offered always two terrible choices. They always find something else that, you as the reader are like, oh shit, right? Like, oh, they're going to do that. It's not perfect, but it's so much better than the other ones. And it's the one that has the chance of building the world they want. So I think always to ask yourself, like, what, and there's not just a third option. What are the other, infinite options in a quantum universe that could happen in this story?
Mm-hmm. You're so awesome.
I got very fired up.
Awesome. That's thank you, because this is what this is now about me, not about anybody else who's watching this, but this is so deeply important to me, because I know that there are people out there, and I've met many of them. You're one of them, who spend time writing, hours, months writing. And it's a solitary, often very difficult process, emotional process, to get a project from, the idea stage to publish. And I don't know anything about that life, except that we don't see most of it. And we got this nice, beautiful book, but we don't really know what went into making it. And I think that being able to ask those questions and to approach literature in that way is also a way to sort of honor that, the author made choices and had a lot of different options and was thinking about us, the reader, while doing this. We had in our Solar Power, the Afrofuturism reading group that I'm a part of, we had the opportunity to talk to Kaya Shanti Wilson, who wrote Sorcerers of the Wild Deep and A Taste of Honey. And he was talking about, like, what he wanted the reader to have to confront while reading his work, and that he left certain things vague and ambiguous because he wanted the reader to have to walk to this crossroads and decide on how they were going to interpret the ending, and then figure out whether or not the ending that was offered to them, and I like your use of the idea of an offering, was the one that they needed, right? And I think of like Get Out and the discussion about the alternate endings, and I remember hearing that Jordan Peele was kind of like, at the time that when I wrote the movie, I had a very different ending, and then stuff happened in the world, and I realized that we needed to see something different. And, you know, Nnedi Okorafor talks about needing the Black girl. I think you were there when she was doing that presentation, needing the Black girl to win. And we need stories where we can actually see like young Black girls who are often characterized as, you know, available for domination, physically, sexually, intellectually, being able to, with all of that reality, still like win, right? Win hardcore. And I can go, there's so many examples of that. So, so yeah, I very much appreciate what you've shared. And I hope that when I revamp the 7 calorie shell, like the rating system for me, that I'll be able to you know, integrate these principles and talk about and honor your creation of this framework, this, what was the word that Adrienne Marie Brown, it's the recovery of these principles, so that I read better and that others can add to the ways, if they so choose, to the way that they read. So thank you very much. I have lightning round questions that I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
This is supposed to be the silly part. We'll see if it gets silly. Okay. So don't think too hard. Just answer. It's all good. Okay. Star Trek or Star Wars?
Oh, I can't do, no. No, I actually wrote an answer to this on something one time, and I was like, I'm going to be with Ben Sisko on the, you know, bridge of the Millennium Falcon, flying through the wormhole to liberate like Tatooine. Like we need them both, right? Like we have, but if you're asking me if it's like which Star Trek, it's Deep Space Nine, hands down. Fight me. Best Star Trek ever.
Your favorite hairstyle and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think my afro usually is a little bigger. I have to wash it, but yeah, I think I love it. I love wearing it because it references, you know, the 60s and 70s for a lot of folks, and I think especially for like older Black folks who are like, yes! I'm like, I love that reaction. You know, and I love it because sometimes it makes white people really nervous, and I get to be like, why are you so nervous about hair that's on my head? Maybe you want to like think about what's happening for you. So.
If you could play a board game with anyone on any plane, who would it be?
Oh my God. That is huge. You mean like a fictional world as well?
Anyone.
Oh my God. I can't. I don't know.
What is your board game? What is your favorite board game?
My favorite board game. I do love board games, actually. It's super nerdy. I don't know. I love Trivial Pursuit. I mean, I do have 6 different editions of Trivial Pursuit. So probably Trivial Pursuit. It's intense. No one wants to play with me. It's cool. I think I was thinking I would like to play with Geordie LaForge. And I don't know why, but when you asked that, I was like, Geordie would be an amazing person to play Trivial Pursuit with.
Cool. What was your favorite cartoon growing up?
Oh,
or now.
Yeah, I was like, or now. So still so many. I was like, I love cartoons. I recently watched the new She-Ra. It's amazing. Y'all should get on that if people have not seen it. Netflix new She-Ra reboot, so good.
Cool.
Because I did love me some She-Ra as a kid, but I haven't rewatched it because I knew just from my memory that it was awful on so many levels.
Yeah.
And so it's really nice to see something you loved as a kid, but would actually discourage children today from watching. Like, don't watch that kid. Don't reboot it in a way where you're like, oh my God, this is so good. Kids, gather around. I'm not saying it's my favorite, but that is one that I watched recently that made me happy.
If you could imbue any technological device, any digital device with magical properties, what device would it be and what magical property would it be?
Wow. These are like, I can't believe these are lightning round questions. I feel like I need to like sit and think about this for like an hour.
Well, for me, it would be cell phones and levitation, so that I could like angle it whatever way I needed it to, whatever purpose I had at the time.
So you could get the perfect selfie every
I mean,
time.
maybe.
No, that's amazing. That is an amazing answer. Yeah, it is a great question. I do feel like I have to think about it more. I mean, I have been working on a story around biohacking, and there was someone who implanted a chip in their leg, and then they could always sense where magnetic north was, like in real life, like not like today.
Right.
Like someone like put a computer chip in their leg, and then they can always sense where magnetic north is. Okay. And I always get, and I get lost. And I was like, I would do that. They're just like doing it in their house. So I'm like, maybe not at your kitchen table with some like bottle of alcohol and like cotton balls. But like when it gets to the next level, I would totally, I'm like, you're like that's a superhero, right? I'm like, you now have superpowers.
Well, a lot of the things that the superheroes from the 60s and 70s did, we can do now with technology, right? Like I know that there's in Toronto, and you probably have something like this where you are, but you can go and you can go to these places where they strap like a high pressure air device on a backpack, and it pushes the air down, or maybe it's water, and you can actually fly a little bit, right? And so, I mean, I'm sure that in the 80s when I was watching cartoons, I saw superheroes doing things like that, right? So it's cool. So that was it. Yeah, maybe I'll rework the questions so that they're a little sillier. I guess.
No, they're awesome questions. I do. I mean, maybe give them to people ahead of time.
Yes, I will do that. Well,
because I'm like, that last one I'm gonna sit with, because I'm like that is, because I'm like thinking Nnedi Okorafor and her like magic, that that it's magic, it's technology, it's spirituality, it's all these things together, it's nature, and I'm like, yes, there's so many possibilities. But
well, you know what? If you come up with anything between now and the next little while and you email it to me, I will add it to the video because I'm going to have to do intro anyway, or anything else for that matter. We can be flexible in time travel, all those things. But yes, that is it for our interview. Thank you very much for spending time with me today and sharing the fabulousness that is Walidah Imarisha. So thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for the space you're holding to just really like dive into these creative spaces and think about, what we bring back from them, and getting to, like really deeply engage with, the wonder of it.
Yeah.
I appreciate the way that you approach, books and the ways that you're a conduit to bring it back into this world.
Thank you. I appreciate that.